Please join me in welcoming Sam Staley to the great state of Kansas.
Thank you, James. It's actually great to be in Wichita. I've been working for 30 years to get here, and I finally got here. And it's actually literally been on my radar screen for almost that long. And part of it is because George and I have had acquaintances of every place except Wichita over the years. But actually, I'm from Dayton, Ohio, and Dayton is the birthplace of aviation. So there's always been this sort of connection to aviation, and I wanted to know more about it, and I never quite got a chance to do that. Before I get started, and I'm actually putting a timer on because I want to make sure I have room for Q&A, and I will probably, and I'll try to make sure I get through this enough. Art, that was a great presentation. Where's Art? Okay. I mean, it was, what was really interesting, he included every slide I wanted to, but cut out. As he was going through it, although I don't know much about Wichita, and I think that's important, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, because everything I say, you're going to need to process, because you know Wichita, I do not. So even if I will say something that seems like a recommendation, really what I've learned over the years is those recommendations have been very useful for people to focus thinking more than anything else. So I'm not coming in here to actually give you the plan or the solution, because actually I agree with Art. There's no silver bullet in a sense, but there are certain things we've learned. A little bit of quick background on this though. So my first urban redevelopment project was as a consultant, and it was in 1986. I was actually working on urban economic development and revitalization as part of the first wave of researchers working on enterprise zones. And so I've been involved in this for a long time. So what my role here is, at least this is what I told James my role was, whether it works out or not, is to try and take this a little bit higher, provide some bigger sort of thoughts about how all of this sort of fits together in terms of what's going on globally as well as nationally. However, I will say this again, everything Art was saying, I could say Cleveland. I could say Columbus, Ohio. I could say Tampa, Florida. I could say everything he's talking about is actually what's happening in the urban space. Now, I'm also an urban economist. I don't do a lot on rural economics, but everything said about cities is right. In other words, why are we growing? Why is Wichita growing? It's because it's a city. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, and I invite you, as you come up with questions about what that means, to probe that a little deeper if I don't answer it over the next 16 or 17 minutes. Okay, first I will get to my slides. Here we go. We've been there. Okay, so thought I would start out with this because I think it's actually pretty important. I don't know, show of hands, how many people have heard of this book, The World is Flat? All right, so this, for me, was a defining book by Thomas Friedman when I started teaching urban economics. Actually, after I'd been teaching urban economics, because it came out after my first course was in 1992. So when I was teaching as an academic, but also I've done a lot of applied work. And I found this very compelling. So the idea is actually the world is not literally flat, but technology is so fundamentally changing the structure of production, the way we relate to people, that geography wouldn't matter. Now, as an urban economist, it's all about geography. It's sort of applying economic principles to space. How is it arranged? So to me, this is like threatening my livelihood. But on the other hand, he was making a very coherent argument that I thought really was making some important points. And essentially, I mean, basically, if you guys have a smartphone, that's really what Friedman's talking about. This thing was designed in Silicon Valley. The software was done in India. It was manufactured in China. The world is flat. All right. However, this is the problem. The world is not flat. The technology is here, without a doubt. It is fundamentally changing the way we relate to each other. It's changing our communities. It's changing how we think about where we can locate. But the world is not flat in the way that Thomas Friedman was talking about. In fact, geography matters a lot. And Art, I think, was beginning to talk a little bit about that as well. So what does this mean? So I already talked about that. Another part of this is that we've got a much more mobile society. And part of that is because and I'll talk a little bit, manufacturing's in decline, which means access to natural resources is far less important than it used to be. As I mentioned, I was from Dayton, Ohio, one of the manufacturing centers of the national economy in the 1920s and 30s and 40s. In the 1970s, Dayton, Ohio lost 15,000 manufacturing jobs in 3 years. We faced some very significant restructuring, and we have not recovered from that. So access to natural resources are not as important as they used to be, and that actually is really important for understanding how cities are going to grow and what we need to do in terms of public policy. But the other part of this is that there are a lot of fundamentals that really haven't changed. Actually, they've strengthened. One is that human capital, people, you in this room, matter much more than it ever has in the past. We are no longer cogs in the wheel. We have to figure out ways in which each individual can become productive. And each individual that is in your community can add value. Sometimes that value is social value. Sometimes that value is what we normally measure as economic value. But somehow we have to do that if you want to survive and you want to be productive. And by the way, that also means we need communities that are truly inclusive. Much more. We don't have the option of letting groups become marginalized when we can bring them into a larger economy and a larger community. So human capital is central. And another thing, I'm going to put a term on some of the things that Art was talking about, agglomeration matters. Now, agglomeration is an economics term. What it essentially means is that the more resources you have in an area, the more productive it becomes, and the more access you have. So one of the reasons we're seeing that larger cities are growing is because they have more resources that actually they can tap into. And those are agglomeration economies. So why did Dayton, Ohio, why was it a center of manufacturing? Because they had a lot of labor and capital that was focused on manufacturing. I'm going to come back to this because it's actually really important for understanding Wichita, I think, at least my understanding of it. The other part of this is that quality of life is huge. Because people are more important in terms of the economics. People have always been important. That's sort of, I always felt they were important regardless. In terms of the economy in the metropolitan area, they're even more important. And because of technology, because of mobility, quality of life matters a lot. And I'll give you, I was working for Reason Foundation. I was working remotely. Reason Foundation's headquarters was in Los Angeles. I was in Dayton, Ohio, raising my kids 5 miles away from both sets of grandparents, something that was actually still pretty rare. And I actually thought that was the way the world worked. At the time, I was on the cutting edge, but this is the way the world is working now. And this is important to understand too. So in other words, it's not about ignoring the things that make life good, however we want to define that, or pleasant. So this is much more important than it has been in the past. And we're seeing that in migration patterns on a large level, and that's one reason why cities are very important, is because cities provide lots of amenities, lots of things to people that to families and others. This is what I think the Brookings Institution has actually called it on this. It is the metropolitan century. We are no longer even thinking in terms of states. And again, reemphasizing something that Art was pointing out, that migration is out of the rural areas. And again, I could take that same map that Art provided and map right over Ohio, which is an industrial center. I can map it over Florida, which is one of the fastest growing states in the country. I can map it over Texas, which is also one of the fastest growing. They're moving to metropolitan areas because that's where most people want to live. That's where the jobs are. That's where the wages are. That's where the employment is. That's where the innovation is. That's where all the things that people value now are. Labor markets are regional. We can talk about the city of Wichita, but the reality is you need to think about the counties that are part of the metropolitan area. When a company decides to move into a region, they're not saying, I'm going to move into based on the downtown. They're going to say, what is that regional labor market? Who am I going to tap into? Who am I going to be able to hire? Will that be sustainable? Will it be long-term? And this, by the way, for me, has been a sort of a grudging movement for me over the last several decades, because I was very much focused for a long time on thinking that individual cities mattered. And I increasingly recognize that it's regions that matter. However, we have to be careful with that. Can't go too far. I can talk a little bit about that in Q&A if you want me to get a few more thoughts on that. Central cities are no longer the drivers of regional economies. That's kind of a harsh reality. Honestly, I got involved in urban economics because I wanted to revitalize a central city. And this was a really hard thing for me to finally come and accept. What we do know is that unhealthy central cities will be a barrier to regional growth. They will bring it down. They'll bring your region down. If you've got a unhealthy central city, it's not working, it's dysfunctional, crime, whatever it might be, not healthy growth, it'll bring it down. But what we're not finding is that central cities will lead the growth of the region. Those factors are regional now. They have gone beyond the downtown. As much as I love downtowns, and I live almost in a downtown, but I live in an inner city neighborhood in Tallahassee. Physical connectedness also really matters. The fact that I think Kansas City is 2 hours one way, right? 2.5, maybe? And then Oklahoma City is 2 or 2.5. That actually is important because that actually provides access to Wichita, but Wichita access to other metropolitan areas as well. And as much as we might think that people are just jet setters anymore, they're not. Being able to connect by vehicle is really important. That's a fundamental. And so that infrastructure, highways and airports. Why was I in Dayton, Ohio? When actually at one point I was traveling to China for my research, working for a foundation in Los Angeles, living in Dayton, Ohio, because I had access to regional airports. And I actually had access to 3. I could get almost anywhere in the United States that is east of the Rocky Mountains and make it a day trip. I could get into downtown Washington, D.C. and give testimony on Capitol Hill faster than my friends living in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. could, because I was so well connected. That's important. That connectedness is important. So infrastructure is actually more important than it's been in the past as a result. The other thing I want to really emphasize as part of this is that innovation is crucial. It's always been crucial. I think we're just getting better at measuring it, and it's in different contexts in which innovation is important. But we're actually, there's a lot of research that's showing the more innovative a metropolitan area is, the more productive it is, the higher the wages are, the more sustainable it will be. So trying to find out how you actually encourage that innovation is an important trick. And I'll also reemphasize what Art was saying as part of this, is I think the venture capitalist analogy was a good one. I talk to venture capitalists a lot because one of the things I do is I actually teach entrepreneurship, and we are working on all sorts of innovations. And venture capitalists, if they're honest, will tell you 80% of their investments don't work because they don't know. They're trying to find the best they can, and these are people that have strong incentives to make sure they find the right one. It's just really hard. So keeping that in mind is important. So if we're looking for the next Microsoft, you might find a company that you think is the next Microsoft, but you really don't know if it's actually going to do it. And that's important too. And by the way, I've done a lot of case histories of cities too, not just Dayton. And I think if you do the case studies, you get into the black box. And this is what you find. And you might be able to take a case study of any city like Silicon Valley and go back to that one thing, but it's not really that one thing. It's something that triggers something that triggers something that triggers something that becomes broader. And then in economics, we call them backward linkages and forward linkages. In other words, forward linkages, you locate an industry, and then you have new businesses that are actually going to move to that area to take advantage of that. And then you have backward linkages, which actually bring companies that are already there into that development of whatever that city would be. So that becomes an important part of this too. Also important to keep in mind that there are very important, this is something I've had to working decades with cities. And again, I always have to think, when is my hope for what I can do get in the way with the reality of what actually will happen? So I always have to think about this. There are global factors that we can't do anything about. This is just stuff that's happening. It's true for New York too, by the way. It's not just Wichita. Dramatic reductions in travel costs. We may be going through blips in maybe short, but long-term travel costs are declining. I mean, the fact that I could fly here to Wichita as cheaply as I could from Tallahassee, Florida, compared to what I would have been doing 30 years ago, it's extraordinary. That's actually going to continue to decline in various ways. Dramatic increases or reductions in cost of communications technologies. This thing is just extraordinary. Matter of fact, most of my communication doesn't even happen verbally anymore. It happens through all sorts of other platforms. That's going to continue. Also, a global effect is the decline in manufacturing. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this too. But it's also important to understand the decline is in employment, not in value created. Actually, America has remained remarkably resilient in making sure that the value it's manufacturing, of what the value of the output, the goods and services we produce, it's been remarkably resilient. I mean, it stuns me because I used to measure things in terms of employment declines because I'm interested in how many people have jobs and how much they're being paid. Actually, what we're finding is that our manufacturing employment is becoming much more productive. And those people in manufacturing are being paid more, but there are a lot fewer of them. Their skills are much higher, the quality, the educational levels are much higher, and I can go into a couple of examples of that as well. Rises in services, human-centered industries, that's going to continue. Actually, what else? Something that's not talked about enough, I think, is the degree to which millennials, the new generation, does in fact optimize over different factors than my generation. My son and my daughter are both out of school and working. One's in Chicago. One's trying to figure out where she's going to spend the next 6 months. The last 6 months was Australia. This 3 months, 2 months was Ohio. The next 2 months will probably be California. Then after that will probably be Indonesia. And then hopefully she'll find herself. At that point, I'd realized, but my family history is not so great on finding yourself before you're 30. But this generation is more traveled, it's more educated, it has greater aspirations, and it has greater goals. The idea of my dad, when he grew up in the Depression and in World War II, post-World War II, even me being in sort of the late baby boom, I had this ethic, I just have to sometimes put my nose to the grindstone and get it done. I may not like it, I'm going to do it. This generation is different, and I work with them all the time. I'm FSU, 40,000 students. I'm working with undergraduates all the time. I have 30 people working in my center. 80% of them are millennials and Gen Z. And I've restructured my entire organization to optimize over those preferences and product. By the way, they are amazing people. I mean, one of the things that irritates me is when people sort of talk about millennials as being lazy. They will work their butts off. And they will start a business in the right context, in the right environment, with the right mentorship. And it's about knowing how they tick. And we're getting better at that, especially baby boomers like me, more Gen X. But they're changing it. They don't understand how to work with the world without this kind of connectiveness. And that changes the way they work and their productivity. So we have to keep that in mind. This is the slide I wanted to get to. It's going to be a little hard for you to see. But essentially what the bubbles are where the changes in manufacturing are. And so what we have is the workers by industry in 2000, workers by industry in 2009. And on the right side is actually the percentage of that region's employment in manufacturing. The point is it's declined dramatically. So the bubbles look like they might be the same in the same metropolitan area, but actually what's happened is we've gone from metro areas with 21, 23, 25% manufacturing to 14% manufacturing. And so what the other part of that is that a lot of that manufacturing has stayed pretty stable. So Dayton, Ohio, another good example. We have a great manufacturing base, it's just smaller. Much more productive, where you have people that are more in machine and die as opposed to being on the production assembly line. They're earning $75,000, $80,000 a year. They're not earning $24,000, $30,000, or $40,000 a year. So this is fundamentally changing. By the way, that's a regional effect as well. The other thing is that professional, scientific, administrative jobs are also increasing dramatically, but here's the takeaway for this, is that it's only happening in certain places. Mainly, whoops, going back. Did it come in? Actually, we'll just go on to this one. I think this is, no, it's not. So there's supposed to be like a circle that actually highlights the coasts. Where you're finding a lot of the scientific, professional, and technological employment is actually on the coast, which actually makes the plains really, really tough. You have Denver, which is doing reasonably well, but a lot of the old line Midwestern plain states that were manufacturing are really struggling. It's really hard. That is a reality that we just have to come to grips with. I don't know how many cities I've worked with that said, we're going to be the next Silicon Valley. No, you're not. Austin came close, but it didn't do it. And that is a real challenge. But I don't think it's going to permanently it's a matter of also taking advantage of the fact that all of this technology that the millennials are taking care of, that means if they love Wichita, they can work here if they want. They can choose to work here. Whereas 30 years ago, we would have had to move to Silicon Valley. My daughter wants to go to California, but has nothing to do with the fact that she has to work there. It's because she wants to experience a different part of the country. She grew up in the Midwest. And so that's different. So where does this lead Wichita? And I'm getting really, really close to being in. All right, so what I'm going to do, I want to run through this. First, real quickly, these are the top 10 employment categories for the Wichita metropolitan area as of May 2018. And I want to just emphasize that some of these categories are big. They're not typically the sexy categories in the sense that these are the things where we want our kids to go be an engineer or they want to be in STEM. But we have a lot of people that are in office administrative support. We do have production occupations, food preparation, service related. When we look at how a metropolitan area's economy is structured, this is in every metropolitan area what it's founded on. We often forget that it's not just the engineers, but it's all the other jobs that also support those other industries. And we have to pay attention to them. These are the people in our backyard. And you can do very, very well in some of these industries. However, what they won't necessarily do is become the driver of economic growth. And here's where I want to spend just a few minutes on, and then I'm actually going to tell myself to shut up so I can get some Q&A in this. There's a tool that we use in economics called a location quotient. If your location quotient is over 1, that means you have a greater concentration of that industry in your region than the benchmark area, this case is the US. Honestly, you just have to look at that to know where your strengths are. It's essentially what that is saying, that if you're looking at where the value added in this economy is being generated, if we looked at Orlando at this point, we'd have a lot of location quotients at 1.2, 1.5, 1.7. You've got off the charts. Now, we were talking at dinner that the problem we do have to consider is putting all our eggs in one basket. That is an issue. So, but here's the reality. Again, another hard learning for me is that when I looked at metropolitan areas that are actually growing, they grow on the existing base. There are very few of them that are ever able to break out of that. Now, that doesn't mean over time you can't have a transition and a shift, but that is a decade-long thing. That is not something that's going to happen in the short term or even the intermediate term. So this is pretty important. By the way, this was what Dayton would have looked like in manufacturing back in 1970, 73, with NCR automobile manufacturing and that type of thing. And this is something that we typically use as heuristic. The first thing we do when we go into regions is we say, what are the location quotients? Where are the industries where you've got employment that's got this great concentration? And then what are the jobs? What are they being paid? And you can see here, those jobs are pretty well paid on average. Those are mean average wage scales. If you're in Orlando, you're looking at 30,000, 25,000. So again, different type of economy. All right, so what I want to do is I want to wrap up here, and I've got a couple other slides here, but so let me just cap this off. I've already mentioned some of this stuff. One is I think it's really important on the local level to think about what you can control and what you cannot control. And that is good strategic management advice, but it's also true for cities. Don't try to think about pushing, tilting at windmills. Think about what can you control? You can control the environment in which people and businesses exist in Wichita. You can do that. Tax policy, you can do that. Investment in infrastructure, investment in education. But don't think that you cannot control the fact that science and technology and services are concentrating in the coasts. And trying to go against that is really, really tough. I'm not going to say it can't because I've been around long enough to know that nothing can never happen. It's just we have to be realistic about that. The other thing that I think we should be keeping in mind, and so think about what you control and what you can't control. The other thing is, this is something that really, as a policy person, avoid panicking. And that may seem obvious, but anytime you hear someone say, we're going to, or you get the feeling that they say, we're going to disappear in 10 years if we don't do that, it's wrong. It simply isn't going to happen. By the way, I have experience in cities that they literally have, over decades, almost disappeared. Cleveland, Dayton, Akron, Ohio. I'm a Midwestern guy, so I see a lot. But we can go to other cities in the Northeast, Buffalo, whatever it might be. But don't panic. I mean, that's not policy that's driven by panic is bad policy. You want to be strategic. You want to be thinking long term. You don't want to be looking short term. And if there's one piece of advice I would have for cities, that I would really focus on that. And also avoid fads. Just because someone says it's happening in Denver doesn't mean it actually, one, is going to last, or two, it's the right thing to do for Wichita. It's all going to be dependent on local context. Finally, I've already mentioned labor force, and quality of life are important in business climate, which Art has already talked about as well. So let me stop there. And I think I've got probably 2 minutes left for Q&A. Yeah.
Okay, no sheepish hand raised. I'm not going to see you. I'm not going to call on you if you're not excited about it. There's somebody all the way in the back I see. Anybody up here before I start walking? While I'm working my way back here, Sam, what was your one takeaway from Dr. Hall's presentation as I'm working my way to the back of the room?
What he was talking about on the entrepreneurship stuff and the net job growth was spot on. One of the things we find in all metropolitan areas, the key difference between growth at the metropolitan area level is net job creation, net business formation that's positive. We actually find that among metropolitan areas, the business closure rate is pretty stable across metropolitan areas. It doesn't matter if you're in Buffalo or if you're in San Diego. It's pretty stable. The key is to get that net business formation rate positive. That's where you get the new businesses. Some of those are going to become gazelles, and that is where that future growth is. So I would say that is my big takeaway.
Okay, right back here.
Just putting two presentations together, Dr. Hall pointed out that the importance of the significance of trying to finance new activities. One thing you may accomplish is relocating, even though it may not add. And then you add with that Dr. Staley's comment that if the central city is dying or rotting, or whatever you want to call it, becoming vacant, it's hard to get people to relocate. It would look like, based on that maybe at least a directed growth towards the central city and a city which was like Wichita and expiring in the middle might make sense.
Again, keeping in mind, I don't know much about Wichita specifically, so all this is kind of off the cuff. However, it's the investments you make in the downtown have to be very strategic, and they actually have to be in areas where there's true value added. And there's a lot of stuff that goes on in downtowns that aren't value added. And I'll give you an example that I use. Unfortunately, I get yelled at a lot in Florida because of this. But I use the film industry as an example of where you can really misfire on this. So Florida, actually, we have one of the top film schools in the country. And so the Florida legislature decided what we need to do is we need to create incentives for a film industry. And so they create a lot of film incentives. Well, the problem is, and you have to take this a little bit on faith because I don't have time to go into how that industry operates, but there are only 2 places in the country which have successfully been able to establish a new film industry, and that is Atlanta, and it's still Hollywood, still LA. Everybody else is just trying sort of way down at the bottom. So the question is, what does Florida do if it really wants to establish itself as a film industry? It invests in its people. It doesn't invest in these projects that'll come in and they'll sort of film, it says what we need to do is we need to invest in producers and cinematographers and videographers that through our schools, and then we have to get them to stay, because then you have them wanting to film in the state and you can start building it. So the key is being strategic. So Florida did the wrong thing, because what it did is it went on these incentives and tried to get Miramax and all these other big studios in Hollywood to just film in Florida. But that really wasn't where their value added was. So the same thing's true in downtown. The question is, are you going to invest in something that's going to add significant value? And some infrastructure is really important. But there's a lot of other stuff that isn't. I hate to say it, but I've yet to find, outside of New York, in Chicago, and Orlando, a metropolitan area where investments in convention centers have had significant or economic development. Now, I will also reiterate what Art said. There are reasons why in this community you may want a convention center, but just be very careful about how you're justifying it. So when I think about downtown investment, I think about quality of life. I don't think about economic development. I don't think about jobs.
All right, I saw 2 more hands. Anybody else? Raise them high. I can't see them if you don't raise them high. I've got 2 more over here. All right, quickly, sir.
Good segue. You said quality of life. I was going in and begging Robert Layton to add more police officers to the staffing study they did. Finally, he did. Now we're having dog bites and attacks that are just going off the charts, and our quality of life has to be impacted by that. Well, how do you get the city's attention to do something about it and get more animal control officers on the street?
Yeah.
Robert Layton is the city manager.
Yeah. I'm really glad that James has just extended my time by 2 hours, so we can talk about that. The answer, there actually is an answer, and I'm just going to throw the bomb out at this point, and you can scatter before you realize it's a dud. You need to hold local government accountable for results. And part of the problem is we are just putting a lot of resources into different programs and services without providing the accountability measures that are necessary. I've looked a lot at police and a lot at crime, and particularly at the neighborhood level. How you do crime, how do you do public safety at the neighborhood and regional level is very different. If you put the money in the wrong place, it's not going to be productive, and you're not going to find the outcomes. There are measures, and I'm just going to leave it at this. There are measures you can use, just most cities aren't using them.
All right, right here's Helen.
20 years ago, Fort Worth revitalized its downtown area almost completely. They built Bass Performance Hall, which was entirely privately funded, and they redid the entire Sundance Square area. That seems to have flowed into the DFW growth. Does that really make a difference, and would that make a difference in a city the size of Wichita?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would actually push back on both the Dallas and the Fort Worth downtown revitalization projects. You're right that physically they look different, and they've actually invested in a lot of buildings. But in terms of how it actually layers into job creation, dynamism, and the innovation, I'm very, very skeptical of most of those results. And I'm going to use, I'm getting myself into so much trouble. So I'm going to use another one of my favorite topics is baseball stadiums. And I know I apologize, but this is important because it illustrates, I think, what you're talking about. So there's this split in sports stadiums on economic developments between academics and, I'll just, for lack of a better term, boosters of sports stadiums. And a lot of times the boosters of stadiums will actually contract with consultants to come in and estimate, right? Well, here's the interesting thing, and I've done a lot of work on this too, and actually is, if you look at the academic studies which look at post facility impacts, they are completely at odds with the projections that come from the consulting, to the point where I've only found, and I actually had a class, an urban planning class, where we're talking about controversies and how to address them, and I used stadiums because they're very popular in cities as one of them. I had to struggle to find one academic study that actually showed a positive economic impact. And it was a single A baseball stadium in Northwest Indiana. That was a case study. So the thing is, it's really tough to sort of think about this. And we don't do a good job of separating out value created for quality of life versus value for economic development and jobs. So I can sit here and say, from an academic's perspective, someone who's looked at this, that if you're looking for revitalizing downtown to create jobs, it's not going to happen. I mean, will it happen? Maybe, but I'm not convinced by Dallas. I'm not convinced by Fort Worth. I'm not convinced by Orlando, which, by the way, has a conventional stadium that seems to be doing reasonably well. I just don't see it. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not a case in Wichita that I'm not aware of because I'm not from here, but I would come in with a lot of skepticism simply because so many times we've tried to do that. My own hometown, it's just but as a quality of life go into it as a quality of life investment. Don't go into it as an economic development investment because the numbers just aren't there.
All right, last question for Dr. Staley right here.
What role does health have to play in the economic development of an area? In Kansas in 1991, we were the 8th healthiest state. We're now the 27th healthiest state. Sedgwick County also boosted one of the highest infant mortality rates in the nation in recent years. So I'm just wondering, is there something about improving the health of an area that would also improve its economic development?
Yeah, so great question. So obviously from a humanitarian perspective, we want better health outcomes. So it's worth investing in the right strategies and programs to do that, regardless. Now, in terms of economics, it actually is important, but it occurs in ways that a lot of people don't think about. Think about why someone's going to move to Wichita. They're not going to move to Wichita if the chances of them dying early is higher. So you want those health outcomes. And in fact, I'm watching the obituaries in the Tallahassee Democrat, and like everybody's dying at 75, and I'm like, I gotta get out of here, at that point. But so no, it is important, and that's part of what this younger generation really does optimize over. They're looking. That's part of it. Is this a healthy place to be? Am I going to be around healthy people, or people that care about their health? That's the other part. So it's not just about being healthy. Do I want to live someplace where there are people that are engaged in lifestyles that are healthy? So those states with obese populations actually have a real challenge because a lot of people, even if they are obese, they don't want to live with around a lot of obese people. And part of that is healthcare. Now, some of that's perception, some of it's real, but regardless, when we talk about migration, perception is often very important.
Thank you, Sam.
All right, thank you.